Rhapsody, a musical adventure, is a very unique JRPG. Originally released in 1998 on the Sony PlayStation, it stood out among a sea of more mature titles by being unapologetically bright and cheery. Similar to something like the Kirby series, it's a feel-good adventure that's also very easy to pick up and play for newcomers to the genre. Developed by Nippon Ichi Software and originally localized by Atlus, Rhapsody, a musical adventure, has you playing as Cornette, the main lead, who can communicate and befriend puppets using her magical horn instrument. The game opens up with a nightmare being seen by Cornette as she's running away from a monster, but she's quickly saved by the man of her dreams. After that, we wake up and are told to go to the forest to get some firewood. And so, accompanied by our puppet companion Kururu, we set off on our epic journey to get firewood. The world of Rhapsody itself definitely feels like something ripped right out of a fairy tale storybook. The warm colour palette and shoujo-inspired character designs is an aesthetic that's pulled off very well here using the game's pixel art and feels very inviting. I'm personally a big fan of that retro JRPG sprite look where the characters don't have mouths for some reason. They kind of remind me of Waddle Dees. Anyway, once we get into the forest, it's here where we're introduced to the musical adventure part of this game's title.
Whenever I hear this song, I really don't know why. It makes me shed a little tear.
That's right, this game is also a musical. I'm not sure how out there this is to admit, but as someone who was brought up in the early 2000s back when musicals were everywhere, I'm personally a huge fan of this aspect when it comes to Rhapsody. Plays, TV shows and movies have plenty of examples of beloved musicals, but when it comes to the video game side of things, which is what I'm personally more invested in, there really aren't many examples out there of games that tackle this genre. There's plenty of games that have lyrical tracks out there, but when it comes to characters actually singing, I can only think of a handful of examples, and it's typically only used on a comedic level, such as Donkey Kong 64's infamous yet beautiful DK rap and that one legendary moment in Conker's Bad Fur Day. As someone who wants to see the interactive medium of gaming grow, I was very much impressed at how Rhapsody, a musical adventure, pulls this aspect off when it comes to its song selection. If you leave the game idle on the title screen long enough, the opening score will play, which better introduces our main characters. What impressed me most about the songs in this game is that they are actually dubbed in English. Usually when a piece of Japanese media like anime or video games are localized from Japanese into English, characters or songs tend to retain their original voices regardless of if you're watching dubbed or not. The openings of most anime in general is a good example of this. I can understand why this is done on a business level, but I've always appreciated when localization goes the extra mile, and for a video game from 1998 to do this in the first place is pretty out there. The main voice actors for Cornette and her rival Eto, who we'll be looking at later on, are genuinely good singers. They have some very impressive vocal ranges and their chemistry when performing duets together are on point. Also, the main motif for Cornette's horn that's implemented in the musical scores is a great bit of storytelling and foreshadows certain connections in the narrative that's revealed later on. This is a very random point, but speaking of motifs, later on in the game you enter a rainforest and just listen to this part of the song that plays. Sound familiar? There's no way this is just a coincidence, and I just found it too cool not to mention. Anyway, it's easy to get ahead of myself when it comes to the musical numbers in Rhapsody since they're very much tied to the game's story, so let's take a step back into the narrative for a moment and continue with the story. After exploring the forest and being interrupted by these cat enemies, we then see the monster from the dream in the opening. And just like that same dream sequence, Cornette is saved by her ideal man, and it turns out that he's a real person. Once again, it's that fairy tale sort of cliche that we're all aware exists. Turns out that the one who saved Cornette is actually the Prince of Mole Kingdom known as Ferdinand, and Cornette is completely heart-struck by him and wants to be a couple, which is her main goal and motivation in the game's story. But as just a small country girl, having a relationship with royalty isn't exactly going to be easy. Act 1 of this game's story is surprisingly a tournament arc. The kingdom intends to marry off the prince with whoever can win this tournament. And it's here where we're introduced to Cornette's childhood rival, Eto. As a noble, she tends to speak down to others and sees herself as above them, but isn't just a one-dimensional character since she has her own arc that you see developed on throughout the story. She's definitely the Ojo-sama character type down to her design and then the unique encounter with the iconic laugh associated with these types of characters. But it's all done in a way to kinda help Cornet with pushing her in the right direction and indirectly helps her in the long run. Similar to any great rival arc, she starts off cold and intimidating but eventually softens up, and it's the reason Cornet gets through the tournament to begin with despite her reputation as a commoner. It's like how rivals in anime are often used to further motivate the characters to do better. Anyway, after some comedic hijinks of attempting to win over the prince's affection through getting the right outfit, fighting against other contestants and most fittingly at a song contest, we managed to win the tournament. Afterwards, we are invited to the castle to celebrate our victory alongside getting to know the prince, but it's not long until things go south. Out of nowhere, we are introduced to the main villains of this game and their leader, Margula, who steals the prince and turns him into stone. After that, we are tasked with saving the prince, and it's here where Rhapsody, a musical adventure, opens up as we go about Marl Kingdom finding 7 elemental stones that will unlock the villain's base, allowing Cornet to save Ferdinand and live happily ever after. Despite its more simple tone, I'm a big fan of this game's story. There's a decent amount of depth to the characters, like your main rival Ethel, who has her own issues to deal with. On top of that, Cornet herself has an interesting past behind her magical abilities that you eventually find out as you progress through the story. The musical sections better illustrate this, having the characters sing about their feelings, and sometimes of course it's done in a humorous way. This game is definitely more comedic than dramatic in tone. I will say though, some of the songs can be hit or miss, but for the most part they are stellar, despite their limited animation of having the characters moving left and right. The presentation of this game in general, like a lot of early titles, definitely has its charm for sure. I feel like it's aged more gracefully, unlike a lot of other JRPGs on the PlayStation that made the jump into early 3D, which can look a little dated compared to the timeless look of pixel art and sprite animations. I can also respect in some ways how this title subverts the trope of saving a princess, which was pretty common in games back then, by reversing the roles. Now that we've established the story of Rhapsody, let's take a look at its gameplay. Rhapsody is a little dated today when looking at this aspect. Combat is fun though. You have the different puppets that you can take into battle that each have their own abilities. Cornet can also buff them and build meter to launch screen wiping attacks. This game is technically a strategy JRPG or tactics game, but I'm only really using quotation marks here. This is since the added level of movement on a grid only ever results in you moving your characters towards the enemy and then just staying there in that same spot until the battle is over. It ends up feeling purely cosmetic and doesn't add any level of strategy. It's not like Fire Emblem where your placements of units matter at all times or anything strategic like that. To further prove this point, the tactics system was ultimately scrapped in later titles in favour of the more fitting turn-based approach, which was something the DS Remaster also changed from the original game. Whilst I can respect it wanting to be different from other JRPGs at the time, the tactics grid feels purely cosmetic unlike Nippon Ichi's later releases such as La Pucelle and the Disgaea games, which further fleshed out this aspect. Despite all this, I did enjoy the more simple and mindless combat of this title. Whilst I'm not a big fan of the fact that this game has a high and random encounter rate, killing enemies takes seconds, so in all honesty it's not really a big pace breaker or anything. When looking for the 7 elemental stones, the game actually lets you go about this in any order you want. One issue this leads into however is that there isn't really a strong sense of direction when considering where to go. Talking to NPCs when visiting towns at times will give you hints, but that can sometimes require you to revisit certain areas. I did get lost at times during my playthrough because of this, but there are some great guides and online resources to point you in the right direction. I just feel like the game is somewhat obtuse and cryptic as a result of this open progression system. Now, if you want me to talk about the weakest aspect of Rhapsody, then the dungeons definitely come to mind. Do you see this dungeon on screen? Well, what if I told you that these were 3 different dungeons? These aren't from the exact same area. The game heavily reuses dungeon layouts just with a slightly different colour palette. These areas are pretty dull, but worst of all is the fact that there is no map here. So what you're dealing with are these labyrinth style dungeons that constantly loop and lead into dead ends on top of the random encounters interrupting progress and further confusing you. So needless to say, you will get lost and lose some progress unless you want to get a paper and pencil and write all this out. Yeah, the dungeons are definitely the weakest point of this title and kinda suck. But I can't really say that they are that frustrating since the game is incredibly short and that also goes for its dungeons, so it's not too offensive because of this. Funnily enough, the DS Remaster of Rhapsody, a musical adventure that released in 2008 did fix some of these problems by having a map on the bottom screen. It's a strange decision, however, when re-releasing this game on modern systems, that they went back to the version without all the quality of life improvements of the DS edition. Granted, after looking at both versions, I would still say that the PlayStation 1 is slightly better in my opinion, mainly because of presumably due to the smaller file size of the DS. For some reason, that version of the game only has the musical sections in Japanese with no dual language support. Also, I'm not really a fan of how they changed the character designs from the original. They look a little more generic or western cartoon-like over the original shoujo anime art style. This was very common in the DS era, where a lot of Japanese games had different looks overseas to fit in more with Western audiences. I'd also like to bring up some smaller, more miscellaneous points about the legacy of Rhapsody: A Musical Adventure. The game was also successful enough in Japan to garner 2 sequels on the same system, which only recently saw an official release over in Western regions with a collection on modern systems. I'm really looking forward to giving these a try at some point. But by far the biggest influence of Rhapsody's legacy is how it inspired the indie game developers Astral Shift to make what I would say is my favourite indie game of all time, that being Little Goody Two Shoes. This title feels like if Rhapsody was made in the modern day with more detailed and impressive graphics. It takes that shoujo look of Rhapsody and dials it to 100 with songs that are fully animated, once again feeling ripped right from a fairy tale. My enjoyment of this indie game is what made me want to play what came before it in the first place, and if you're a fan of Rhapsody, I think that trying out this indie title is definitely a no-brainer. Looking at Rhapsody: A Musical Adventure in the modern day is definitely a hidden gem among a sea of incredible JRPGs that are out there. But even then, it very much stands on its own for being something different. Granted, musicals aren't for everyone, and if they aren't your thing, I can't see this title changing your mind on that. But even then, this game is short and sweet, and as a result of that, I would definitely recommend it to fans of JRPGs that are looking for something different that you can't really find anywhere else. But now, I'm curious, have you ever played this cult classic? Feel free to let me know what you think about it in the comments. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.